They came at noon with a flatbed truck and a hydraulic arm, and Deborah Calloway made certain I was watching when they tore my gate down. She stood on the public easement in her red blazer with her arms folded and her chin lifted, and she told the crew chief that the structure was an unauthorized encroachment on common area access, and that the homeowners association had every legal right to remove it that very afternoon. I was 32 years old, and I had owned that property for 4 years, and the gate she was dismantling had stood on the surveyed line of my lot for longer than the HOA itself had existed. What Deborah did not know, and never thought to check, was that I had spent 6 years before buying that house as a licensed land surveyor for the county assessor's office, and that I still kept every instrument I had ever needed. Stay with this story to the end, because the gate is only the first thing the judge made them put back. The second thing cost the association considerably more than lumber and hinges. Caleb Hurst had watched the whole thing from his truck and driven away without a word, and that silence, it turned out, was a decision he would spend the next 18 months regretting. The truck reversed down my driveway at 12:30, and I stood there with my phone recording and my field notes open, and I did not raise my voice once. By the end of that afternoon, I had 412 photographs, a time-stamped video log, and a very clear idea of what was coming. The board had been so certain that I was the kind of man who would write an angry letter and then go quiet. They were not entirely wrong about the letter. They were wrong about the quiet. Deborah Calloway told the crew chief that morning that nobody fights the board and wins in this county. She said it loudly enough that 2 of my neighbors heard it from across the street, and both of them remembered it later when they were asked to. By then, Deborah was standing in a county courthouse holding a court order that required her association to rebuild my gate to original specification and to pay for the second one as a penalty. The associate judge who signed that order had started the case, convinced it was a minor property dispute that would settle in a week. She finished it, convinced it was something considerably larger. This is how it happened, and why it took the shape it did, and what was left standing when it was over. I had bought the house at 41 Fernwood Lane in the spring, 4 years before the gate came down, and I had bought it specifically because of the lot, not the structure. The house itself was a decent single-story ranch with a composite roof and a 2-car garage set back from the street, built in 1987, and it sat on a corner parcel that measured 112 feet along the street frontage and 94 feet along the side easement line. I had measured both figures myself before I made an offer. The gate in question was a paired iron panel gate, custom welded, 8 feet wide at the mouth and set between 2 masonry pillars that a previous owner named Raymond Pruitt had installed in 1991 after a vehicle cut across his lawn and damaged the corner of his garage wall. Raymond had pulled the permit, poured the footings to code depth, and anchored the pillars on what the survey plat from that same year showed as his own property, set back 14 inches from the edge of the sidewalk right-of-way. Raymond Pruitt had been dead for 9 years by the time Deborah Calloway decided the gate was her association's problem, but his daughter had kept every document he ever signed, and she lived 12 minutes away. I had met her during the home inspection, and she had given me a manila folder without being asked, the way careful people sometimes do when they sense that someone else will appreciate it. That folder contained the 1991 permit application, the final inspection sign-off, the receipts from the fabricator, and a copy of the survey plat with Raymond's own pencil annotation showing exactly where the pillars sat relative to the lot line. I had filed that folder in my cabinet under P for Pruitt and thought very little more about it for the next 3 years and 8 months. The Fernwood Lane Homeowners Association had been incorporated in 2003, which was 12 years after Raymond Pruitt built his gate, a fact that would later matter a great deal. When I moved in, I paid my dues without complaint, attended 2 annual meetings, and introduced myself to Deborah Calloway, who had been board president for 7 consecutive years by that point, and who received my introduction with the warm efficiency of someone who had already formed an opinion. The association managed 46 single-family homes on 3 cul-de-sacs and 2 connector streets, and it operated with a budget of just under $90,000 a year, which Deborah administered through a management company she had selected herself, and which paid her a small consulting fee that was not disclosed in the public budget documents, though it was recorded in the management company's own invoices, a detail that would surface later under circumstances she could not have predicted. In the fall of the 3rd year, I received a letter on association letterhead informing me that my gate constituted an unauthorized structure under Article 7 of the CC&Rs, that it impeded common area maintenance access along the side easement, and that I had 30 days to remove it voluntarily, or the association would arrange removal at my expense. I read the letter twice, looked up Article 7, and wrote back the following week enclosing a copy of the 1991 permit and the survey plat, and explaining plainly that the structure predated the association's incorporation by 12 years and sat entirely within my surveyed lot boundary. I received no reply for 6 weeks, and then a second letter arrived informing me that my response had been reviewed and that my appeal had been denied, and that I now had 14 days to comply. No one had told me there was an appeal process underway. No one told me who had reviewed it or what they had reviewed. The gate was still standing, and I had begun photographing it every week from the same angle with my phone, time-stamped, so that the record of its condition and position would be consistent and continuous and impossible to dispute. The 14 days passed and a third letter came. This one signed not only by Deborah Calloway but also by a man named Caleb Hurst, who was listed as Association Compliance Officer and whom I recognized as the heavy-set man who had been parked outside my house in a white Ford pickup on 3 separate mornings in the preceding 2 weeks. I had photographed his truck each time, noting the plate number and the time. The third letter informed me that I had forfeited my right to an appeal by failing to respond within the specified window, which struck me as a remarkable claim, given that no window had been mentioned in either of the first 2 letters, and that the management company's own correspondence log, which I would eventually obtain through a public records request to the county clerk, showed that my original response letter had been received and logged 12 days before the deadline the association was now claiming I had missed. A neighbor of mine named Terry Goins, who lived directly across the street and had been on Fernwood Lane for 11 years, told me over his fence one evening that 2 other homeowners had been through versions of this same process in the preceding 4 years, and that both had removed whatever the association objected to rather than fight. One of them had taken down a pergola he'd built with a valid permit. The other had resodded a strip of grass along her driveway that the association claimed was encroaching on the shared greenway, though no survey had been conducted to confirm it. Terry told me this quietly and without editorializing, and then he mentioned that he had kept a copy of a letter Deborah had sent him 3 years earlier about a fence post that was supposedly 2 inches out of alignment, and that the letter had included language suggesting his property value assessment might be affected if he did not comply promptly. I asked Terry whether he still had the letter. He said he had it in a drawer. I told him plainly that it might be worth finding. He nodded and went inside, and 2 days later he left a sealed envelope in my mailbox. I added it to my cabinet under G for Goins and kept building the file. I called an attorney named Sheila Tran that same week, a property rights specialist who worked out of an office 20 minutes north of the county seat and who had handled 3 HOA disputes in the preceding 2 years, 2 of which had gone to formal proceedings. She reviewed the correspondence I had accumulated, asked me a series of precise questions about the survey plat and the permit, and told me at the end of our first meeting that the association's position was legally very thin and procedurally very sloppy, and that the only thing keeping it alive was the assumption that I would not press it. She advised me to respond to the next letter with a formal notice of intent to dispute, and to simultaneously file a request for all association records pertaining to my property under the state's Homeowners Association Transparency Statute, which required production within 30 days. I sent both documents the following Tuesday by certified mail. Deborah Calloway signed for them on Thursday morning. What happened next arrived faster than I expected. The flatbed arrived on a Tuesday in late October, and I saw it from my kitchen window at 11:47 in the morning. There were 3 men in the crew, and Deborah Calloway standing at the end of my driveway in the red blazer she favored for official business, and Caleb Hurst was there as well, leaning against his white pickup with his arms crossed in a way that I interpreted as practiced. I stepped outside with my phone already recording, and I asked Deborah plainly what she intended to do. She told me the association was exercising its right of enforcement under the CC&Rs, and that the gate was being removed pursuant to a compliance action authorized by the board at a special session held the previous Friday. I asked her when I had been notified of the Friday session. She told me that member notification for special enforcement sessions was not required under the bylaws. I asked whether she had obtained a court order. She told me that no court order was required for the removal of an unauthorized structure within the common easement. I told her plainly that the structure was not within the common easement, that I had a survey plat and a 1991 county permit establishing its precise location 14 inches inside my lot boundary, and that proceeding with removal without a court order while I was present and objecting would constitute trespass to chattels at minimum and potentially conversion. I said this calmly and at a volume that 2 of my neighbors who had come to their front doors by that point could hear clearly. Deborah looked at me for a moment and then told the crew chief to proceed. The hydraulic arm extended. The gate came down in under 4 minutes, both panels and one of the masonry pillars, which the arm clipped on the second pass. The pillar had not been part of any authorization I had heard mentioned. The crew left the iron panels stacked on my lawn and the pillar rubble in a pile at the edge of my driveway and drove away at 12:31. Deborah told me as she walked back to her car that the association would bill me for the removal costs and that I had 30 days to dispose of the materials. She did not look at the pillar rubble. Caleb Hurst had gotten into his truck while she was talking and was already moving down the street. I spent the next 2 hours photographing everything, measuring the exact position of the remaining pillar and the footing exposure with a measuring tape and marking the coordinates with my GPS unit, which was still calibrated to county benchmark standards from my time in the assessor's office. I had 1,907 photographs by 4 o'clock and a voice memo running from the moment the truck arrived. I called Sheila Tran at 4:15 and told her what had happened and what I had documented. She told me to send her everything that evening and to touch nothing on the site. She said it in a way that told me she was already thinking about an injunction. Sheila filed an emergency motion for injunctive relief the following morning in County Superior Court, attaching 43 exhibits drawn from my documentation, including the 1991 permit, the survey plat, Raymond Pruitt's annotated copy, my GPS coordinates showing the pillar footing's position relative to the lot line, 6 of my weekly time-stamped photographs showing the gate's condition before removal, the 3 association letters with their conflicting timelines, the certified mail receipts, and the management company's correspondence log entry confirming receipt of my original dispute response. She also attached a copy of the transparency statute request I had sent and noted that the 30-day production window had not yet elapsed, but that the destruction of the subject structure during an active dispute constituted spoliation of the physical evidence in the matter. The judge assigned to the emergency docket that morning was a woman named the Honorable Patricia Solis, who had been on the county bench for 11 years and who was known by Sheila's description as someone who did not tolerate sloppiness in paperwork. Judge Solis read the motion that afternoon and issued a temporary restraining order by 5 o'clock, prohibiting the association from disposing of the gate panels and pillar rubble and requiring them to preserve the site as found. She scheduled a preliminary injunction hearing for 10 days out and noted in her order that the association was to appear with counsel and with the full documentary basis for its enforcement action. Sheila told me that evening that the speed of the restraining order was itself a signal, that Judge Solis had seen enough in the 43 exhibits to move without waiting for a response brief. I went out to my front lawn after the call and looked at the iron panels lying on the grass and the pillar rubble at the edge of the driveway, and I thought about Raymond Pruitt, who had pulled every permit and filled every footing to depth and annotated his own survey plat in pencil, and how he could not have known that someone would still be reading those annotations 33 years later to put what he built back where he put it. The association's attorney, a man named Frank Weir, who handled most of the HOA work in the county, filed a response brief 4 days before the hearing, arguing that the gate had been properly classified as a common area encroachment under the CC&Rs, and that the association had followed its own enforcement procedures, and that the motion was an overreach by a homeowner who had failed to exhaust the internal appeal process. Sheila pointed out in her reply that the appeal process had never been formally described to me, that the window I had allegedly missed had never been stated in any of the 3 letters, and that the association's own correspondence log disproved the claim that my response had arrived after any deadline. She also noted that Frank Weir's brief contained no survey evidence of any kind to support the encroachment classification, only a reference to the CC&Rs text itself, which described common area easements without providing coordinates or measurements. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Judge Solis entered the courtroom for the preliminary injunction hearing with a copy of the 1991 permit in her hand, which told me she had read the exhibits. She asked the association's attorney at the outset whether he had a survey establishing the gate's position relative to the common area easement boundary. Frank Weir told her that the association had relied on the CC&R's description and the compliance officer's visual inspection. Judge Solis asked whether the compliance officer was a licensed surveyor. Weir said he was not. She asked whether the association had obtained a survey at any point before or after the removal action. Weir said it had not. She set the copy of the permit down on her bench and asked him to explain why an association incorporated in 2003 believed it had authority to remove a structure built under a valid county permit in 1991 without obtaining a competing survey or a court order, while the property owner was present and objecting and in possession of the original permit. Weir told her that the CC&Rs granted the board enforcement authority over unauthorized structures in common areas, and that the board had made a determination in good faith. Judge Solis said plainly that a determination without a survey was not a determination about a boundary. It was a preference about a boundary, and those were not the same thing. She converted the temporary restraining order into a preliminary injunction within 20 minutes of that exchange, and ordered the association to restore the gate to its original specification within 60 days at its own expense, using a contractor of my approval. She also ordered the association to produce all records pertaining to my property and to any other enforcement action involving a gate, fence, pillar, post, or driveway structure in the preceding 7 years, within 30 days, under the transparency statute. Caleb Hurst had attended the hearing and left immediately after the injunction issued without speaking to anyone. Terry Goins had come as well, sitting in the back row, and he found me in the hallway afterward and said only that he wished he had thought to keep better records 3 years ago when they came after his fence post. What neither of us knew yet was that the 30-day production order was about to do considerably more damage than the injunction itself. The management company's records arrived on the 28th day in 4 bankers' boxes, and Sheila spent a weekend going through them with a paralegal and an accountant named Douglas Park who specialized in nonprofit financial compliance. What Douglas found in the third box was the disclosure that had been missing from the association's public budget documents for 5 consecutive years, a line item in the management company's internal invoices describing a monthly consulting payment to a company called DRC Advisory, which stood for Deborah Rose Calloway, and which had been running at $1,100 a month since the year Deborah had selected that management company over 3 competing bids. The total over 5 years was $66,000. None of it had been disclosed to the board members who were not Deborah, and none of it had been disclosed to the 46 homeowners who paid the dues that funded it. Sheila filed a supplemental motion within 48 hours. Douglas Park filed a complaint with the state's nonprofit oversight office the same afternoon. The case was no longer a gate dispute. The formal hearing before Judge Solis on the supplemental matter was scheduled 6 weeks after the supplemental motion was filed, and in the intervening period, 3 things happened in sequence that reshaped the proceeding entirely. The first was that a woman named Linda Ashworth, who had served as the association's treasurer for 4 of the 5 years Deborah's consulting payments had been running, contacted Sheila's office and asked whether she could speak to someone. She came in on a Thursday morning and explained that she had, on 2 separate occasions, asked the management company for a full itemized invoice breakdown, and been told both times that the invoices were proprietary to the management contract and not subject to board review beyond the summary totals. She had found this explanation unsatisfactory, but had not pressed it further, and she had kept copies of the email exchanges in which the refusals were made, along with copies of the 2 meeting minutes in which she had raised the question formally. Her copies were cleaner than the management company's own records, which Sheila noted with the kind of flat appreciation that meant she was already thinking about how to use them. The second thing was that Frank Weir withdrew from representing the association and filed a notice with the court citing an unspecified conflict of interest, which Sheila told me without elaboration meant he had seen the financial documents and decided the case had changed shape. The association retained new counsel, a younger attorney named Marcus Bell, who had not been involved in any of the prior enforcement actions and who made no effort to defend the consulting arrangement, and instead focused his early filings on the narrower question of whether Deborah's financial conduct could be attributed to the board as a whole. It could not, as it turned out, or at least not entirely. The third thing was that 2 of the other 46 homeowners who had received enforcement letters in the preceding 7 years hired their own attorneys after the supplemental filing became public record, and both attorneys filed motions to intervene in the proceeding, which Judge Solis granted. One of those homeowners was the man who had taken down his permitted pergola. He had kept his permit. He had simply not known, at the time, that keeping it would eventually matter. At the formal hearing, Deborah Calloway appeared with Marcus Bell and testified for just over 2 hours. She maintained for the first 40 minutes that the consulting arrangement had been disclosed verbally at a board meeting and that she had simply assumed the minutes reflected it. When Sheila introduced the minutes for each of the 5 relevant years and walked through them line by line, and no such disclosure appeared in any of them, Deborah amended her account and said the disclosure had been made informally, outside a formal session. When Sheila asked her to identify any board member who could confirm that informal disclosure, she was not able to do so. Caleb Hurst had agreed to a separate interview with the State Oversight Office and had told investigators that he had known about the consulting payments and had been told by Deborah that they were a standard arrangement disclosed to the membership. He had not verified this himself. He cooperated fully and provided copies of internal emails he had retained, and the Oversight Office treated his cooperation as a mitigating factor. Judge Solis issued her final ruling 8 weeks after the formal hearing. The ruling ran to 41 pages, and I read all of them. It voided the association's enforcement action against my gate in its entirety, and held that the removal had constituted trespass and conversion, and it ordered the association to rebuild the gate at original specification, to restore the damaged pillar at original specification, and to pay me $6,400 in documented costs including Sheila Tran's fees for the injunction phase. It further held that Deborah Calloway had breached her fiduciary duty to the association's members through the undisclosed consulting arrangement and ordered her removed from the board immediately, barred from serving in any HOA governance role in the county for 7 years, and directed to repay the full $66,000 to the association's general fund within 90 days, jointly with the management company, which had processed the payments with knowledge of the arrangement. The management contract was voided. The state nonprofit oversight office, acting on Douglas Park's complaint and the documents produced through the litigation, opened a separate administrative proceeding against both Deborah and the management company principal, which concluded 4 months after the court ruling with a civil penalty of $22,000 against the management company and a permanent bar on the principal from managing homeowner associations in the state. The association hired a new management company and reconstituted its board with 3 new members elected at a special meeting attended by 31 of the 46 homeowners, the largest turnout in the association's 23-year history. The man who had taken down his permitted pergola filed a separate small claims action and received $1,800 in compensation for the cost of the original structure. The woman who had resodded her driveway strip filed a letter with the new board, asking for an acknowledgement that no encroachment had ever been established by survey, and the new board provided one in writing within 2 weeks. Terry Goins made no formal claim but attended the special meeting and asked several careful questions about the new board's disclosure policies, and the answers satisfied him. Caleb Hurst resigned his compliance officer role before the ruling was issued and was not named in any of the financial findings, and the last I heard he had moved to a different part of the county. Frank Weir's conflict of interest was never publicly explained, and I did not press it. The gate was rebuilt on a Thursday in early spring, 61 days after the court ordered it, 1 day past the deadline, which cost the association an additional $400 in contempt compliance fees under the order's terms. The contractor my attorney approved was thorough and worked from photographs of the original panels, and the new gate was indistinguishable from the old one except that the welding was slightly cleaner along the upper rail. The pillar was repoured and the masonry matched within a shade. The crew chief asked me at the end of the day whether the position looked right to me, and I told him I would check it, and I did, with the same GPS unit I had used on the morning after the demolition, and the centroid of the new pillar base was within 3 inches of the original footing's center coordinate, which was close enough that I said nothing and signed the contractor's completion form. I kept one of the original iron panels. The contractor had brought a spare and left the extra on my lawn, and I leaned it against the inside of my garage wall where I could see it from the door. It was bent along the lower left corner where the hydraulic arm had caught it, and I did not straighten it, because the bend was the most accurate record in my possession of what had happened and how it had been answered. Sheila Tran closed the file and mailed me a copy of the final ruling with a handwritten note on the cover sheet that said simply that cases like this one were why she had gone into property law, and I thought that was a complete enough statement that I kept the note in the manila folder with Raymond Pruitt's documents, where it has stayed. The judge, the Honorable Patricia Solis, ran into me at the county clerk's office about 8 months after the ruling while I was filing an unrelated plat amendment for a survey project I had taken on as a part-time consultant, and she paused in the hallway and told me plainly that she had thought about the case more than once since she closed it, and that the thing that had struck her was not the financial misconduct, which she had seen variations of before, but the gate itself, the fact that a man had built a thing properly in 1991 and kept the paperwork and his daughter had kept it after him and I had kept it after her, and that the only reason any of it had worked was that 3 people across 33 years had understood that a document in a drawer is not a burden, it is a reserve. I told her I agreed, and that my father had taught me the same principle with different words, and that I thought of him every time I opened that cabinet. She nodded and went on her way. The spring that year was wet, and the corner lot filled out faster than the years before, and by June the grass along the driveway had grown back to the edge of the pillar base, and the ground had stopped looking like a place where something had been taken. It looked again like a place where something had been put, and kept, and defended, and restored. The board that tried to remove my gate without a survey, a court order, or a single measurement believed that authority declared loudly enough becomes authority in fact. What it becomes instead is evidence.